This is my update for Russian military operations in Ukraine for April 19th, 2022. Now, there's a lot of information here. I'm going to show you primarily what I'm going to be focused on. These two briefings from the U.S. Department of Defense. This is Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby holds a press briefing April 18th, 2022, so just yesterday. And also this one, senior defense official holds a background briefing. I'm going to pick out the pieces of information that I think are most important. So we're going to start with John Kirby's briefing first. He mentions this heavy military equipment that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. This has been making all kinds of headlines. People are claiming, you know, this is going to help Ukraine win this war. And I just want to point out some possibly inconvenient facts that really show you how futile this whole process is, and how there are contractors making millions, if not billions of dollars off of this, and how this isn't going to help Ukraine really at all. So he talks about 18 155 millimeter howitzers along with 40,000 rounds, 18 howitzers, 18 pieces of artillery that they are going to send to Ukraine. Russia has destroyed hundreds of vehicles, including tanks and artillery pieces, aircraft. 18 pieces of artillery, 18 extra pieces of artillery is not going to make a big difference here. They're going to destroy them just like they destroyed everything else that's been on the battlefield. They're also sending counter-battery radar, CBR. These are radar systems that detect an enemy artillery barrage. It traces the round back to where the artillery piece is, and it gives your gunners the ability to target their guns and destroy them, CBR. Artillery units work together with all of these different parts as a single coordinated unit. It's very effective, but that's if you have the time and the training to be effective. They're talking about training Ukrainians outside of Ukraine to then go back to their country and train the actual units that will be using this equipment. And this first round of training hasn't even taken place yet. So it will be days, if not weeks, before these crews are even familiarized with these weapon systems. Now, I want to show you something. This is from the U.S. Army National Guard. It's titled Field Artillery Firefinder Radar Operator. This is the CBR, what I was just talking to you about. It is a 10-week course operating Firefinder equipment, basic workings of radar and identifying objects, field tactics and combat communications, calculating recording speed, direction, and altitude. The Pentagon might succeed in training Ukrainians how to operate this equipment, how to fire these artillery pieces, but they will not be able to teach them how to do it effectively. And the equipment that they were already trained on, were already familiar with, had been using for years, has already been destroyed. That is why the U.S. is sending them additional equipment. This is not going to help Ukraine turn the tide of the battle. Now, on the actual battlefield, John Kirby admits that it is Russia shaping the battlefield. They are carrying out combat operations to shape the battlefield. That means taking territory away from Ukraine to make it easier for them to fight this battle for Donbas in the way that they want to, in the manner that they want to, at the time and at the place that they want to. When you are shaping the battlefield, that is because you are winning. You are dictating the terms of the fight to your enemy. So all of this that we've heard about Ukraine winning and how incompetent Russia has been, if Russia is the one shaping the battlefield, even according to the Pentagon, then that means Russia is winning, not Ukraine. This is John Kirby talking. They're trying to set the conditions for more aggressive, more overt, and larger ground maneuvers in the Donbas. Then they talk about combat power. This is the amount of men, munitions, and machines that Russia prepared for this specific operation in Ukraine. Not what Russia has in total to draw from, what they prepared specifically for these operations before February 24th when they began. John Kirby Pentagon spokesman. He is admitting that Russia still has access to the vast majority of this combat power. So again, we keep hearing about Russian losses, how their fighting capacity is about to collapse any day, but this is the Pentagon saying otherwise. Now on to the other briefing, the senior defense official background briefing. He claims, and this is what the Pentagon has been claiming for days, if not weeks, that Mariupol is still contested. When you hear the word contested, it makes it sound like Ukraine and Russia are fighting over Mariupol, and it could still go either way, but it cannot go either way. This map, this is liveuamap.com, and this is actually one of the sources that Twitter includes in their list of verified and reliable sources for the situation in Ukraine. So it is definitely a pro-US, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine media website. These maps, they will update it instantly if there's even a rumor that Ukraine took some sort of territory from Russia, and it'll lag days, sometimes weeks, even after it's utterly confirmed that Russia has taken territory. But even they are saying that Mariupol, this is where the fight for Mariupol is down to. Just the Azovstal steelworks. This is a factory, essentially, a complex of factories and warehouses and workshops right on the coast. That is the only area left. Everything else is taken by Russian forces for miles and miles. And just to show you how disconnected the Western media is from reality, you have Tom Bowman from NPR, and he says, with Mariupol, is the city completely surrounded, or are any supplies getting in, perhaps from the north to the defenders? Again, this is a pro-Ukrainian map, and they are showing you just how hopeless it is for these quote-unquote defenders trapped in a factory on the coast, surrounded by angry Russians. They're not getting out, and no supplies are getting in, unless Russia says so. This senior defense official also talks about the major operations in Donbas. The Ministry of Defense in Ukraine says these major operations by Russia have already begun, either yesterday or earlier today. The Pentagon says these are still shaping operations. So they're talking about that. They're also talking about this city of Nikolaev. Let me show you Nikolaev. Let's zoom out a little bit. This is Crimea. That is Mariupol right there. And Kherson is right here. And Russian forces have taken Kherson and have basically liberated it, I guess. The pro-Russian people living in Kherson have been given control of the city. They will be running it from now on, not any sort of administration loyal to Kiev. And then they have been pushing towards this city, Nikolaev, which in Ukrainian is Mykolaiv. And across the river here is Odessa. And Russia seems very interested in both of these cities. And it looks like they are getting closer and closer to Nikolaev. And once they have Nikolaev, I can almost guarantee you they will continue onward to Odessa. In what order they will do all of that in, it is hard to tell. They are also extremely interested in Kharkov in the northeast. I will show you that on the map. So from here, let's zoom out. This is the Donbas region. You can see how the red is Russia, and they are encircling this area. This whole line here, this is the line of contact. This is where Ukrainian forces have been fighting the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, the People's Republics, for 8 years now. And Kharkov is up here. And Russian forces are right outside the outskirts of that city. Ukraine has continuously said they are making counterattacks across the board. They may carry out a counterattack, and they may temporarily take some sort of territory from Russia, but they are not sustainable. They do not have the ability to sustainably push Russia back from anywhere. The only place Russia has withdrawn from was around Kiev and other areas in northern and northeastern Ukraine, but that was after they announced those withdrawals a week earlier. Those were withdrawals that they deliberately made. And I'll get into that in a moment, because there's a myth that I really want to lay to rest once and for all. A lot of questions are still asking about the Moskva, this guided missile cruiser that sank off the coast of Ukraine. The Russians said there was a fire, then an ammunition explosion. It was damaged. They were trying to get it back to port and it sank. Ukraine claims that they shot 2 Neptune anti-shipping cruise missiles at it. They have no evidence at all to prove that they did that. And no evidence has emerged, even to the point where the Pentagon, this briefing, they have said they have no idea why it sank. They have no idea. And the media very persistent, asking them for any shred of information that they can twist into a Ukrainian victory. The Pentagon was very insistent on not giving it to them, which is very interesting, I think, and telling. The senior defense official, and it's common during these briefings to give the number of Russian air sorties. That is a mission that a Russian aircraft will fly. When it takes off, it flies a mission and it lands. That is 1 sortie. During that sortie, it could hit no targets. During that sortie, it could hit multiple targets. The Pentagon says that Russia is flying on average around 200 sorties per day, and that goes up and down from 200 all the way up to 250 from week to week. This senior defense official also talks about the Russians shaping the battlefield. They say, we still believe that the Russians are doing a fair amount of shaping. They're still moving in command and control, artillery, other enablers into Donbas. And as I've said since the beginning, the last time we talked, they've increased their footprint by another 11 BTGs in Ukraine. BTG is Battalion Tactical Group. That's anywhere between 600 to 800, sometimes even up to 1,000 Russian troops. And these are heavily armed formations. They have main battle tanks, all types of artillery, including rocket artillery, an anti-air missile battery. All of this is integrated into one functioning unit. It's extremely powerful for such a small unit, relatively speaking. And this is the building block that Russia uses when moving its forces around. The Battalion Tactical Group, BTG. You'll hear a lot of talk about this if you're following these briefings day to day. The Pentagon also says that there's about a dozen of these battalion tactical groups involved in Mariupol. And if that's true, once the fighting is done, that will be another 12 or so battalion tactical groups that can move to the Donbas region or elsewhere, wherever they're needed, really. And that, again, a single battalion tactical group is a significant amount of firepower. A dozen of them, that is a lot of men and equipment. And I thought this was interesting. The Pentagon, the Western media present for this briefing kept talking about these little counterattacks that Ukraine's been making. They made it in this village, in that village, and they were asking about what the significance was. And the Pentagon just flat out said, look, this region in the Donbas has been contested for 8 years, and the territory has changed hands many times over the last 8 years. These little counterattacks don't necessarily mean anything significant on a strategic overview. And he's absolutely right. You need to look at the vector sum of the fighting. And the vector sum of the fighting right now is Russia taking more and more terrain from Ukraine. Russia shaping the battlefield any way that it sees fit, and Ukraine constantly reacting to it. So again, this is from the Pentagon, the U.S. Department of Defense. This is not from the Russian media. This is not from the Kremlin. That's about it from these two briefings. They're talking about a huge uptick in fighting in the Donbas. The Pentagon believes it's still shaping. Kiev thinks that this is actually the beginning of Russia's attempt to completely encircle and destroy those tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces on the line of contact with the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. I want to take this opportunity to lay to rest this myth of Russia's attempt to take Kiev, because in preparation for this update, I was over at War on the Rocks. This is a website, War on the Rocks. Actually, let me show you this. This is the website, and they've got almost weekly podcast with Ryan Evans and Michael Kaufman, who is supposed to be some sort of expert analyst regarding the Russian military. And watching his commentary evolve over the last couple of weeks has been absolutely fascinating. And I was listening to this, and they were talking about how Russia failed utterly in trying to take Kiev. This is their most recent podcast. So they're still trying to perpetuate this myth that Russia attempted to take Kiev. Let's talk about some historical examples of a military taking a city. What does it require? And did Russia have anything even close to what was required to take Kiev? I'm going to give you an example from the United States military, a very well documented example. And this example will compare and contrast Russia's success or failure, depending on what you think, what your opinion is, of Russian operations in Mariupol, because Mariupol will be the other example that I show you. And then we will look at the Russian and Ukrainian troop dispositions before and during combat around Kiev. And you tell me if you think that Russia was really trying to take Kiev. So here, this is the U.S. Army in the Iraq War. This is a book from the United States Army War College Press. This was published in 2019. Coalition analysts have estimated that there were about 4,500 hardcore fighters in Fallujah. The U.S.-led coalition had 18,000 soldiers, Marines, and special operators. 18,000 to 4,500. That is a ratio of 4 to 1. 4 to 1. 4 attackers for every 1 defender. And that took almost a month and a half for the U.S. to take Fallujah. It was a third the size of Mariupol. It had half the population as Mariupol. And they had 18,000 soldiers and Marines and special operators storming that city to take it. And it took them a month and a half to do it. What about Mariupol? How many Russian forces were there to defenders, attackers to defenders? Well, let's just look at this Economist article. This Economist article says 3,500 soldiers faced 14,000 invaders. Again, that would be a ratio of 4 attackers for every 1 defender. And what did they do in Fallujah? If you go to that book and read it, it's a PDF, it's free, it's online. They say they encircled Fallujah, they cut off any route of escape, any route that the enemy could use to reinforce the numbers in there or resupply them or rearm them. And that is exactly what Russia did around Mariupol. They encircled the city, and then they moved in on the defenders. Now, what about Kiev? So the U.S. going into Fallujah in Iraq, 4 to 1. 4 attackers for every 1 defender. Russian forces in Mariupol during this actual conflict, 4 Russian soldiers for every 1 Ukrainian defender, 4 to 1. And in both cases, both cities were encircled before they worked on trying to take the city. What about Kiev? How many Russian soldiers were there for every defender in Kiev? Let's look at some of the numbers here. This Guardian article says that there were somewhere around 30,000 combat troops within striking distance of Kiev. Now, that was before the invasion. That was troops in Belarus. When they went into Ukraine, they did not all go toward Kiev. They went elsewhere. But I'm going to give them benefit of the doubt and say 30,000 Russian forces went to Kiev. Let's just say it was 30,000. How many were defending it? This CNN article, Kiev has transformed into a fortress with its residents determined to defend it. And they provide a number of some 18,000 volunteers armed by city authorities. 18,000. And that is in addition to the actual armed forces that were charged with defending Kiev. Now, I do not have a complete cited list of who these forces were, but I've gotten a couple, more than enough to make my point here. So this is from France 24. Defending Kiev, I'm 100% sure the Russians won't get through. Who was saying that? It was a soldier of Ukraine's 72nd Brigade. This is a tank brigade It is one of at least two that I'm aware of. A tank brigade, a Ukrainian brigade, could have somewhere between 1,600 to up to 4,000 soldiers. So let's just say it's around 2,500. So that's 18,000 plus another 2,500. Here's a Forbes article. A single Ukrainian tank brigade stands between the Russian army and Kiev. So this is an additional tank brigade a little bit further out from Kiev, and it would have consolidated its forces. This is another 1,500 to 2,500 troops, in addition to the 18,000 armed volunteers. And then there is this Times article, Azov Battalion, we are patriots. We're fighting the real Nazis of the 21st century, says the guys who literally have Nazi symbols on their uniforms. These were Azov Battalion members present in Kiev and involved in its defense during this conflict. So you had 18,000 armed volunteers, you had at least two armor brigades, and you had Azov Battalion. If you add all of that up, it's somewhere around 23,000, and it could be much more than that. And the number of Russians around Kiev could have been less than that. But what does that say? The ideal numbers, giving the benefit of the doubt at a lower end number for defenders and a higher end number for attackers, the ratio is still 1.3 to 1. So Fallujah and Mariupol 4 to 1, Kiev 1.3 to 1. Does that sound like Russia prepared itself to take Kiev? And the answer is absolutely not. There have been a lot of very sensible explanations as to what Russia was doing around Kiev and many other cities that it approached but never took, and never assembled the numbers that they would need to take these cities. What did they do? They were fixing Ukrainian forces into place. They were fixing tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces into place all around the country so that they could not reinforce their actual objective, which would, say, be Mariupol or Kherson. These are cities that Russia has taken that are now firmly in Russian control. Fixing those Ukrainian troops into place elsewhere is what allowed Russia to achieve these objectives. This is what they did for 7 years in Syria. They made contact with the enemy all over Syria. They locked them in place, and then they took a single task force from one city to the next, taking those cities back by force, encircling them, and then taking them, just like Russia did to Mariupol. And this is what they're going to continue doing throughout the rest of this operation. I just thought I would point that out. Someone needs to explain to me, if you really think Russia was going to take Kiev, why they went against all conventional thinking when it comes to taking a city, why they would have done that, why they would have had such a low ratio of attackers to defenders, why they would do that and expect any sort of success, versus a much more sensible explanation being they were just fixing those forces in place. Speaking of Mariupol, let's finish this update talking about Mariupol, the situation in Mariupol right now. We're zooming into Mariupol. As you can see, this red is all Russian-controlled territory. They have established a significant land bridge from Crimea across southern and eastern Ukraine all the way up to the Russian Federation border. That is a significant achievement. And they have Mariupol not only entirely encircled, but engulfed. The only territory left that is quote-unquote contested is the Azovstal Steelworks. This is a factory, an industrial complex, and that is where the very, very last Ukrainian fighters are holed up in. And this is not a contested city. This is a city taken by Russia with a little bit of mopping up left to do. Now, these holdups are from the Azov Battalion. These are Nazis. They have Nazi symbols on their uniforms. They were admitted as Nazi military formations by the Western media before all of this started, and then they began trying to whitewash their image as Nazis, claiming they were rolled into the National Guard and they're not Nazis anymore. Well, if that were true, why didn't they switch their unit insignia? Why is it still a Nazi symbol? Because they're still Nazis. They are extremists, and anyone who is being honest will tell you that that is what they are. And so these Nazis are held up in this steel factory. And this is a Reuters article. This is from yesterday, April 18th. Ukrainians defy Russian surrender demand in Mariupol on Easter of war. And I want to go down to the part where they're talking about the steelworks, right here. A representative in Mariupol of the Azov forces, a one-time far-right militia, now part of Ukraine's National Guard, who still have Nazi insignia on their uniforms, whose destruction is among Moscow's war objectives. That would be the denazification part of Russian President Vladimir Putin's three main objectives, said international intervention was needed to help civilians, including children, sheltering at the steelworks. There are civilians at Azovstal who are afraid of Russia's guarantees for their exit, the Azov representative said in a message to Reuters. Reuters has not been able to verify whether there are significant numbers of civilians at the plant. There aren't any. This is Azov trying to save their skin. A lot of people have claimed that Azov, despite being Nazis, they're tremendously brave and courageous. I believe that they continued fighting in Mariupol because throughout the entire time they were utterly convinced that Kiev would send a force to break through the Russian encirclement and get them out. And now, this is the second time I've seen them try to come up with some sort of political solution to their predicament. We remember they were claiming that Russians were using chemical weapons. This was in the very desperate hope that the Western world would intervene militarily and save them. That didn't work. Nobody bought that. And even the Western media had very little to work with on that. And now they're claiming that there's children hiding with them in the steelworks and there needs to be an international intervention to get them out. So they're fighting on, they're being stubborn, they refuse to surrender because they refuse to be held accountable for what they have done over the last 8 years in Mariupol. And if you want to know what they've been doing in Mariupol for the last 8 years, go to Patrick Lancaster's YouTube channel and go listen to some of the interviews he has done with people living in Mariupol who see themselves as having been liberated by people they saw as occupiers. But I just thought that was interesting. That's what they're trying to do to save their skins. They're modern day Nazis surrounded by angry Russians. If they are caught by the Russians, they know they're going to be held accountable. They're going to be held accountable for what they did. They will go on trial. A lot of them will spend probably the rest of their lives in prison. They know that. They're fighting on because they're convinced that there is some sort of chance to save their skin, either through a military breakthrough of the encirclement, which is beyond possibility, or some sort of political solution where they're either exchanged for Russian prisoners or some sort of deal is made to evacuate them with these, children they claim are huddled with them in the steelworks. As armed combatants and supposedly defensive forces of Ukraine, it was their job to evacuate Mariupol before hostilities began. By pretty much every measure, it was these defensive forces in Mariupol that deliberately prevented the civilian population from leaving so that they could use them as human shields. This is something that even the Washington Post has written about. And actually, because people won't believe me, it's this article right here. The link to this will be in the video description below. Down here it says, the Ukrainian military has a responsibility under international law to remove their forces and equipment from civilian populated areas, and if that is not possible, to move civilians out of those areas. If they don't do that, that is a violation of the laws of war, because what they're doing is they are putting civilians at risk, because all that military equipment are legitimate targets. And so Azov battalion and the rest of the Ukrainian military defending Mariupol, it was their job to evacuate Mariupol, or it was their job to remove themselves from the city and fight outside of it. They did neither. And now they're claiming Russia shouldn't continue bombing them and shelling them and rooting them out of this steelworks complex because they've got children huddled in there with them. Utterly despicable. it's a microcosm of this wider war. And this is the reason why Russia had to go in there. This is the reason why Russia couldn't negotiate, not with Kiev and not with Kiev's Western sponsors. And we're going to see a lot more examples of, the mask falling off and the very true nature of Ukraine's government and its security apparatus and what the people of Ukraine had to put up with all of these years since 2014. So that's it for this update regarding Russian military operations in Ukraine for April 19th, 2022. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. Check the video description below if you're watching this on YouTube, where else you can find my work in case YouTube deletes my channel. I'm also on Odyssey and on Rumble. I'm also on Telegram. I'm very active on Telegram, so the links will be there. Follow me on these other platforms just in case. In the video description below, there will be all of these links that I just went over. There's a lot of them. Please check them out. There are also ways you can help support my work. You could do that through Buy Me a Coffee, through Patreon, and through PayPal. The links will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. I couldn't do this work without that support. And as always, thank you for watching.